Oh, it seems I have a visitor this evening. Welcome. The night sky hangs clear and cold tonight, the aurora dancing green above the peaks. And I know you've come to rest beneath it. Take things slowly, and all will be well. I have some tales to share, ones that you may like. Tonight, we drift far from Skyrim's snow, across ages long buried, to speak of a name whispered by grave robbers and mages alike. A student of light who chose the dark, a mortal who reached for the throne of a Daedric prince and became a moon that hangs above us still. His name is Mannimarco, the king of worms. Are you all settled for this night? Good. Our story begins long ago, in the earliest days of recorded history, on an island that most maps of Tamriel do not show. This is the Isle of Artium, the third largest island in the Somerset archipelago, tucked away in the warm southern waters near the coast of the high elven homeland. Artium is a place of quiet meadows and low green hills, of orchards heavy with fruit, and gardens that bloom in soft colors all year round. Mist clings to its shores in the mornings, curling between old stone towers, and the air smells of salt and blossom. For much of Tamriel's history, the island vanished entirely from the world, drifting somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary sailors, before reappearing centuries later as though it had never left. This is the home of the Psijic Order, the oldest known monastic group in all of Tamriel, keepers of an ancient magic they call the Old Ways. The Psijics were counselors and sages, elves who studied the deep currents of the world and offered their wisdom to kings and rulers across the land. They dressed in simple robes, and they walked their gardens in silence, listening to a magic older than the spells taught in any guild. To be accepted among them was a rare honor, granted to only a handful of gifted students in any generation, and in one such generation, 2 students stood above the rest, both of them of the Altmer, the high elves of golden skin and long years. Both were brilliant, both were hungry to learn. Yet from the very beginning, something set them apart from one another, a difference that ran deeper than talent or ambition. The first of these students was named Vanus Galerion, though that was a name he took later in life. His nature was warm and open, drawn toward the light. He believed that knowledge should be shared, that the secrets of magic should not be locked away behind the walls of a single order, but spread freely among all who wished to learn. His magic was bold and bright, direct as sunlight falling across a field. When Galerion cast a spell, it was clean and sure, and those who watched him work felt a kind of ease, as though the world had settled into its proper place. The second student was Mannimarco. He came, by his own account, from among the Aldmer, and some tales whisper that royal blood ran in his veins, though which royal line remains uncertain even now. Where Galerion was warm, Mannimarco was cold. Where Galerion reached toward the light, Mannimarco turned his gaze the other way, toward shadow, toward silence, toward the quiet places where the living seldom look. He was patient, he was watchful, and there was a stillness about him that made even his fellow students step back, a sense that behind his pale eyes turned thoughts they would rather not know. For a time, the two studied side by side within the Psijic fold, sharing the same masters and the same lessons. They walked the same misted gardens and read from the same ancient books. Yet even as their skill grew together, their hearts pulled in opposite directions, one soul warm, one soul cold, one reaching for day, one reaching for the dark. And in the quiet corners of Artium, far from the eyes of his teachers, Mannimarco began to feel the first pull toward a study that the Psijic Order held forbidden, a fascination with death itself, and with the fragile, flickering thing that mortals call the soul. Vanus Galerion channeled magic that smelled of ozone and sun-baked stone. His hands produced spheres of bright golden fire that illuminated the open courtyards of Artaeum. The heat of his fingertips singed the edges of his robes and warmed the faces of the initiates standing nearby. He shaped raw magicka into precise luminous geometries, leaving the air humming with energy. His spells bloomed with light and force, forming solid barriers of glowing amber or sealing deep cuts on injured wildlife. He stood firmly in the sunlight, demonstrating his craft for all the island to see. Mannimarco worked in the lower, damp caverns of the island, far from the sunlit gardens. He handled marrow, dried tendons, and the cold remains of woodland creatures. He ground animal bones into fine white dust, using a heavy stone mortar, the scraping sound echoing off the wet walls. He poured black sand over dead rodents, watching the skin pull tight over their ribs as he applied his magicka. His spells cooled the air. When he cast, frost formed on the cavern walls, and the scent of damp earth and stagnant water filled the enclosed space. He filled glass jars with murky alchemical fluids, submerging harvested organs and severed limbs to halt their natural putrefaction. He focused his attention heavily on the capture of souls. He placed a clear, jagged crystal on his stone work table. He held a dying gull in his hands, its breathing shallow and erratic. He spoke a guttural incantation, forcing a wisp of pale white light to pull away from the bird's beak. The light sank into the crystal. The gem immediately turned a deep, cloudy purple. It vibrated against the stone table, emitting a low, continuous hum. Mannimarco held the glowing gem, examining the trapped energy inside. He extracted that energy to fuel his own spells, draining the gem until it turned grey and brittle. He gathered worms from the damp soil outside the cave, observing how they consumed and broke down flesh. He bound these scavengers with minor spells, making them writhe and move in unison across the stone floor. He studied the physical mechanics of decay, mapping out the slow degradation of muscle and sinew in intricate diagrams drawn with charcoal. Rumors and fragmented texts place Mannimarco far from Artaeum during a fractured period of history known as the Middle Dawn. During this temporal anomaly, the sky above Tamriel shifted into unnatural hues of bruised violet and sickly green. The sun rose in the west and set in the east. Rain fell upwards from the soil into the clouds. A group of robed figures known as the Marukati Selectives stood on a high mountain peak, dancing in tight circles around a towering staff. They chanted rhythmic, dissonant words that vibrated the rocks beneath their feet and cracked the bedrock. The air around them distorted, rippling like water over a hot flame. Mannimarco observed them from a distance. He watched them manipulate the fabric of reality, watching as they attempted to strip divine essence from the world. He recorded their incantations on tightly bound scrolls, the ink freezing on the parchment in the unnatural cold. He absorbed their methods of tearing apart the natural order, learning the deep mechanics of manipulating souls on a cosmic scale. Through his exposure to this fracture in time, his physical body aged out of sync with the rest of the world. He returned to Artaeum, carrying the weight of countless unseen centuries. His eyes sunken and his skin pale and stretched tight over his sharp cheekbones. He walked with a heavy, deliberate step, carrying the secrets of the Selectives hidden in the folds of his robes. Back on the island, Mannimarco expanded his experiments deep within the coastal caves. He dragged larger carcasses across the wet sand, their hooves leaving deep gouges in the shoreline. He assembled skeletal structures from mismatched beasts, binding the joints with glowing blue threads of magicka. The reanimated constructs dragged their heavy limbs across the stone floor, their bones clicking and scraping against the rock. He piled discarded ribs, shattered skulls, and extracted organs in the dark corners of the cavern. The stench of rotting meat and stagnant water began to drift upward through the rocky crevices. The scent carried on the sea breeze and reached the upper gardens of the Sijic Order. Vanus Galerion followed the smell of decay away from the blooming orchards. He walked down the damp stone steps into the lower caverns. The temperature dropped with each step, and condensation dripped from the ceiling onto his shoulders. He heard the clicking of bones and the low hum of charged soul gems before he reached the bottom. He stepped onto the cavern floor, his sandals crunching on scattered bone dust. He saw the piles of remains, the squirming mounds of worms, and the glowing purple gems scattered across Mannimarco's work tables. Galerion stood in the entryway, watching a skeletal construct twitch and shudder in the cold air, preparing to confront his fellow student under the shadows of the island's ancient towers. Vanus Galerion stopped at the entrance of the lower cavern. He watched the skeletal construct twitch on the cold stone. Mannimarco stood by a heavy stone table, examining a glass jar filled with dark alchemical fluid. Galerion stepped forward, the sound of his sandals echoing against the wet walls. He pointed toward the squirming worms on the floor and the piles of extracted ribs in the corner. He told Mannimarco that his experiments broke the oldest laws of the Sijic Order. He stated that manipulating the souls of the dead twisted the natural flow of magicka and disrupted the spirit world. He demanded that Mannimarco cease his work immediately, gather his tools, and leave the lower caverns. Mannimarco did not look up from the jar. He carefully sealed the lid and placed it on the stone table beside a glowing purple soul gem. He turned toward Galerion, his pale face partially hidden by the shadows of the cave. He traced his fingers over the jagged edge of the soul gem, feeling the vibration of the trapped energy. He told Galerion that the Sijic Order limited themselves by focusing only on the forces of life and creation. He stated that true power required understanding the mechanics of decay. He pointed to the skeletal construct, dragging its heavy limbs across the floor. He explained that mastering death allowed a mage to bypass the fragile limits of a mortal body. He refused to abandon his research. He stated that he would continue his work, regardless of what the order demanded. Galerion stepped closer to the stone table. The heat from his hands caused the frost on the cavern walls to melt, forming small puddles on the floor. He warned Mannimarco that the path of necromancy only led to madness and isolation. He argued that binding a soul against its will caused irreparable damage to the fabric of Mundus. He pleaded with his fellow student to return to the sunlit gardens and resume their studies of the old ways. He stated that the right master would discover the hidden laboratory eventually, and the punishment for practicing the dark arts would be severe. He offered to help Mannimarco dismantle the skeletal constructs and cleanse the cavern of the rotting remains. Mannimarco picked up a heavy iron mortar and began grinding a fresh pile of animal bones into white dust. The scraping sound filled the cavern, drowning out the dripping water from the ceiling. He ignored Galerion's offer. He stated that he had no interest in the peaceful meditations of the upper gardens. He claimed that the right master's teachings were incomplete and overly cautious. He scooped the white bone dust into a small leather pouch and tied it shut with a blue thread of magicka. He told Galerion that they no longer shared the same goals. He turned his back on his former friend and walked deeper into the cavern, leaving Galerian standing alone among the scattered skulls and the low hum of charged soul gems. The divide between them had been spoken aloud, setting the foundation for a conflict that would stretch across the centuries. The senior masters of the Psijic order walked down the wet stone steps into the lower caverns. They held torches that cast long, flickering shadows against the damp rock walls, illuminating the narrow passageways. The scent of decaying meat and stagnant seawater filled the confined space. The Rite Master stepped ahead of the group, his leather boots crunching over scattered fragments of animal bone. He stopped in front of the heavy stone table and observed the glass jars filled with murky fluids, the squirming mounds of worms, and the glowing purple soul gems. A skeletal construct composed of mismatched animal parts dragged its heavy limbs across the floor, its joints bound together by blue threads of magicka. The Rite Master raised his staff and slammed the wooden base against the stone floor, sending a shock wave that shattered the blue threads and reduced the construct to a pile of scattered bones. The guards escorted Mannimarco from the cavern into the central chamber of Chepera Tower. The chamber walls consisted of smooth grey stone, illuminated by narrow shafts of sunlight piercing through the high windows. The senior masters stood in a wide circle around the perimeter, their hands tucked into the sleeves of their heavy robes. Mannimarco stood in the center, his hands resting at his sides, his pale face completely still. The Rite Master stood before him and pronounced the sentence of the order. He stated that practicing necromancy twisted the natural flow of magicka and disturbed the rest of the dead. He declared Mannimarco exiled from the Isle of Artaeum for the remainder of his life. He reached forward and pulled the ceremonial Psijic sash from Mannimarco's shoulder, letting the woven fabric fall to the stone floor. Mannimarco looked at the fallen sash, his expression remaining perfectly blank. Vanus Galerian stood near the heavy wooden doors of the chamber. He watched the sash drop to the floor and stepped forward, his hands clenched into tight fists. He approached the Rite Master and raised his voice, the sound echoing off the high stone ceiling. He argued that casting Mannimarco onto the mainland delivered a dangerous plague to the rest of Tamriel. He stated that the punishment for manipulating souls and reanimating corpses required immediate execution. He pointed toward the lower caverns, describing the trapped spirits and the piles of rotting flesh. He demanded that the order use fire and steel to permanently stop Mannimarco's work, insisting that exile merely relocated the disease. The Rite Master turned his gaze away from Mannimarco and looked at Galerian. He kept his hands resting on his wooden staff. He stated that the Psijic order preserved life and refused executions within the walls of Artaeum. He declared the judgment final and instructed the guards to take the exile to the docks. Galerian stood in the center of the room, watching the guards lead his former friend out through the heavy wooden doors. He stared at the stone floor, his breathing heavy and erratic as the sound of footsteps faded down the corridor. The guards led Mannimarco down the dirt path toward the shoreline. The morning fog hung thick over the water, leaving a layer of cold dew on the wooden docks. A small skiff sat tied to a wooden post, swaying gently in the incoming tide. The guards instructed Mannimarco to board the vessel, handing him a single burlap sack containing a plain linen tunic, a water skin, and a few glass vials. Mannimarco stepped onto the boat and sat on the wet wooden bench, placing the sack at his feet. He reached inside his robes and touched the small leather pouch of bone dust he had managed to conceal from the masters. The boatman untied the thick hemp rope and pushed the skiff away from the dock with a long wooden oar. The oars splashed into the grey water, propelling the small boat through the dense salt mist. Mannimarco watched the white stone towers of Artaeum shrink in the distance until the fog swallowed the island entirely. He turned his attention forward, staring at the approaching coastline of mainland Tamriel. He listened to the rhythmic splashing of the oars and the distant calls of seagulls. The skiff bumped against the muddy banks of the continent, the wood scraping loudly against the rocks. Mannimarco picked up his burlap sack and stepped out of the boat. His leather boots sank deeply into the wet, dark earth of the shoreline. He walked past the scattered fishing nets and the wooden trading carts of the coastal village, moving directly toward the dense tree line. He navigated through the thick underbrush, walking for days to find the hidden caves and isolated cabins scattered across the wilderness. He sought out the hedge wizards, the outcasts, and the bitter practitioners of forbidden magic. He carried the secrets of the Marukati selectives and the dark archives of Artaeum, ready to offer them to anyone willing to listen and learn the ways of the flesh and the soul. Mannimarco walked across the dirt roads and rocky mountain passes of mainland Tamriel. Couriers and travelers carried the details of his teachings across the continent, reaching the ears of those who sought the magic of the grave. Hedge wizards, disgraced scholars, and witches emerged from the dense forests and isolated swamps to find him. They tracked his movements to abandoned stone forts and deep limestone caves, bringing him offerings to prove their loyalty. They handed him brass amulets, stained with dried blood, polished wooden staffs, topped with cracked skulls, and heavy iron rings, set with dark onyx. Mannimarco took these items in his bare hands. He focused his magicka and extracted the dark energy stored within the metal and wood. The objects crumbled into grey ash and splinters between his fingers as he pulled the raw power directly into his own veins. The massive influx of magical energy physically altered his body. His skin lost its natural flush, shifting to a pallid, chalky white. The flesh pulled tight over his cheekbones and jaw, and the blood vessels beneath his skin turned a deep, bruised purple. His heartbeat slowed to a faint, irregular thud, and his body took on the rigid, cold appearance of a corpse. The magical saturation halted his natural aging process, extending his lifespan indefinitely while leaving his physical form in a state of visible decay. During the early years of the Second Era, Vanus Galerian walked through the paved streets of Firsthold. He stood on wooden platforms and spoke to large crowds of citizens and traveling merchants. He organized the Mages Guild, drafting charters with black ink and heavy parchment. He directed masons and carpenters to construct guild halls in the center of bustling cities. These buildings featured large glass windows, wide double doors, and open courtyards. Inside, apprentices practiced elemental magic, leaving the air smelling of roasted wood and sharp ozone. At the exact same time, Mannimarco operated in the shadows of those very cities. He convened with his followers in damp subterranean cellars and the deep crypts beneath local cemeteries. He organized his practitioners into a strict hierarchy, assigning them specific tasks regarding the harvesting of buried bodies and the trapping of wandering souls. He distributed heavy black robes and cowls to his highest-ranking members, officially establishing the Order of the Black Worm. He stood at the head of a long wooden table in a torch-lit vault and declared himself the Arch-Necromancer, claiming absolute authority over the study of death and the reanimation of flesh. Mannimarco needed raw materials and stone structures within the established settlements of Cyrodiil. He sent representatives dressed in clean, unadorned robes to the imperial offices. These agents placed stacks of gold coins on wooden desks and submitted formal applications to the local clerks. The clerks stamped the parchment with red wax seals, granting them legal status and property rights under the name of the Fellowship of Anchorites. Operating under this official title, the members purchased abandoned storehouses and secluded estates at the edges of the towns. They drove horse-drawn wooden carts filled with exhumed remains, bone dust, and stolen soul gems through the city streets at night. Dark, viscous fluids often leaked from the corners of these crates, leaving stained trails across the cobblestones. The locals pointed at the rotting wood and the swarms of insects. Swarms of black flies gathered around the locked wooden doors of their properties. The smell of sulfur and decomposing meat seeped through the floorboards and drifted into the narrow alleyways. Pale, segmented maggots crawled out from the cracks in the stone foundations, coating the damp earth in a writhing layer of white bodies. The commoners covered their faces with their cloaks and crossed the street whenever they walked past the properties. The people of Tamriel watched the profane events trailing Mannimarco's footsteps and named him the King of Worms. The title spread through the taverns and market squares, spoken in hushed voices over wooden mugs of ale. Mannimarco accepted the title. He sat on a large throne carved from fused femurs and pelvic bones deep within a subterranean vault. He wore a crown fashioned from blackened iron and polished human teeth. His followers knelt on the damp stone floor, their heads bowed, awaiting his instructions. He looked down at the growing ranks of his cult and the vast network of spies and bone-gatherers he had established across the provinces. He possessed the numbers and the magical strength to challenge the traditional orders of Tamriel. He commanded his acolytes to rise from the floor. He unrolled a large parchment map of the continent across his bone table, weighing the corners down with heavy iron candlesticks. He picked up a rusted iron dagger and drove the blade directly into the paper. The tip of the blade pierced the drawn symbols representing the shrines, temples, and graveyards guarded by the priests of the divine cycle of life and death. He directed the gaze of his followers to the dagger, marking the consecrated grounds and the protective blessings of the burial god as the next targets for their growing army. Mannimarco observed the rituals performed by the priests of Arche. He stood at the edge of village graveyards, watching as the holy men sprinkled powdered silver and crushed grave tar over freshly dug soil. He saw them press heavy iron sigils into the dirt, reciting incantations that locked the physical remains in a state of rigid stasis. Arche's law formed a physical barrier of golden light around the buried corpses, preventing foreign magicka from entering the dead flesh. When Mannimarco attempted to push his own blue magicka through the barrier, the light flared brightly, burning his fingers and leaving a permanent scorch mark on the palm of his hand. The blessings of the burial god directly counteracted the methods he used to reanimate the dead. He recognized Arche as the primary obstacle to his order's expansion. He addressed his acolytes in the damp cellars of Cyrodiil, his voice echoing off the curved stone ceilings. He instructed them to target the priests and their consecration rituals. He described the precise mechanics of dismantling Arche's wards. He taught them how to pour diluted blood over the silver dust to break the chemical reaction. He showed them how to carve counter-sigils into the surrounding trees, redirecting the flow of the priest's magicka into the roots of the forest. The worm cult spread across the provinces, implementing these tactics. They intercepted caravans carrying the specialized grave tar and replaced it with ordinary pitch. They broke into local temples at night, scratching deep gouges into the iron sigils stored in the vestries. Mannimarco evaluated the work of other independent necromancers across Tamriel. He visited their hidden camps and reviewed their crude methods. He watched them attempt to raise corpses using raw physical force, relying on brute strength rather than precise magical manipulation. The reanimated bodies often collapsed after a few steps, their joints snapping under the sudden strain. The independent practitioners failed to stabilize the decaying muscle tissue, resulting in messy, inefficient constructs that broke apart during basic tasks. Mannimarco noted their lack of discipline and their inability to control the lingering remnants of the original soul. He dismissed them entirely, referring to them as uneducated amateurs. He severed all communication with these isolated hedge wizards, directing his focus solely toward the organized ranks of his own fellowship. He demanded strict adherence to his established protocols. He required his followers to memorize complex anatomical charts and study the precise flow of magicka through the human nervous system. He rewarded the acolytes who successfully bypassed Arce's wards and punished those who failed. He watched a high-ranking member of his cult manipulate a fully stabilized skeletal construct without using any visible gestures. The bones moved smoothly, perfectly balanced and completely silent. Mannimarco acknowledged the precise control and elevated the acolyte to a higher position within the order. He praised the servants who executed his commands with exact precision, building an army that operated with mechanical efficiency. He turned his attention away from the localized disruptions of graveyards and focused on a much larger scale. He sought complete control over the cycle of souls. He spent days in the subterranean vaults, studying the cosmic structure of Mundus and the flow of energy between the mortal plane and the realms of oblivion. He drafted new incantations on large sheets of parchment, calculating the exact amount of magicka required to intercept a soul before it reached the afterlife. He plotted a direct course toward total dominion, aligning his order's actions with a singular, massive objective. He aimed to dismantle the established order of the Pantheon, preparing to position himself above the burial god entirely. 300 years passed. Rain fell on the torn linen banners of old empires. Mercenary armies marched across the thick mud of the central province of Cyrodiil. Men in dented iron armor drove wooden spears through the dirt and clashed against rival factions. The ruby throne in the imperial city collected dust under the high domed ceilings. Stone walls crumbled around the capital, and grey ash coated the cobblestone streets. Warlords fought over the province, leaving fields of blackened wheat and splintered wooden wagons behind their marching columns. Eventually, a Colovian military leader named Varan Aquilarius marched his soldiers through the city gates. He struck down the ruling dynasty with heavy steel and claimed the imperial city. He sat on the ruby throne, wearing a heavy gold crown, while the brass braziers around the Temple of the One remained dark and empty. The dragonfires, the traditional flames of the recognized emperors, sat cold and filled with packed grey soot. Varan possessed a common bloodline, separating him from the divine heritage required to light the fires. He stared at the cold braziers and ran his calloused fingers over his iron breastplate. Mannimarco stepped into the imperial throne room, his dark leather boots clicking against the polished marble floor. 3 centuries after his exile from the Isle of Artaeum, his physical form remained exactly the same. His pale skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones, and his purple veins throbbed faintly under his collar. He approached Varan and unrolled a long parchment scroll across the stone floor. The scroll displayed detailed ink drawings of the Amulet of Kings, a massive red diamond set in heavy gold. Mannimarco traced the ink lines with his pale index finger. He told Varen that retrieving the ancient amulet would allow them to perform a highly specific ritual. He explained, the ritual would persuade the dragon god Akatosh to alter Varen's bloodline, injecting the divine heritage into his veins, making him a true dragonborn, and allowing him to ignite the dragon fires. Varen gathered a specialized group to find the lost artifact. He stood at the head of a large oak table, surrounded by his most trusted allies. Lyris Titanborn stood directly behind his right shoulder. She stood over 7 feet tall, the blood of ancient giants adding massive thick muscle to her frame. She wore heavy steel plate armor that clanked with her every movement and carried a double-bladed battle axe resting against her heavy leather boots. Sai Sahan stood on the opposite side of the table. The Redguard warrior wore intricately linked steel chainmail and kept his hand resting on the leather hilt of a curved longsword. He served as the captain of the Dragon Guard, his eyes constantly scanning the stone arches and shadows of the room. Abnur Tharn sat in a high-backed wooden chair, adjusting the heavy gold rings on his fingers. He wore layers of fine crimson silk and embroidered velvet, acting as the imperial chancellor and the head of the wealthy Tharn family. Mannimarco stood at the foot of the table, his dark robes pooling on the stone floor, completing the group known to the court as the 5 Companions. Mannimarco operated carefully within the group, steering their actions from the edges of the room. He held private meetings with Abnur Tharn in the damp lower levels of the imperial palace. The 2 men stood over flickering candlelight, passing sealed wax letters and small leather coin purses back and forth across a wooden barrel. Mannimarco leveraged the gold reserves and signed edicts of the Tharn family to expand his own worm cult under the direct protection of the imperial guards. He drafted the ritual instructions himself, dipping his quill into a pot of black ink and writing complex geometric formulas designed entirely to tear the physical barriers between the mortal world and the realms of oblivion. He used the Emperor's demand for the throne to serve his own ends. He steered Varen's armies toward ancient ruins and collapsed tombs, directing the soldiers to dig through the dirt and shattered stone in search of the red diamond. The 5 Companions spent 2 full years riding across the rocky terrain of Cyrodiil. They camped in dense pine forests and explored deep subterranean caverns, pushing aside heavy stone doors and fighting through ancient mechanical traps. Sai Sahan led the marches, cutting through thick green vines with his curved blade and clearing pathways for the rest of the group. Lyris broke through wooden barricades with the heavy flat of her axe, sending splinters flying into the damp cave air. Varen pushed them forward, his eyes focused entirely on the promise of the burning braziers and a secure empire. Mannimarco walked behind them all, his hands tucked into his dark sleeves, his pale eyes tracking the dirt paths. He waited patiently as the group climbed the snowy peaks of the Colovian Mountains, the cold wind pressing against their cloaks as they finally approached the collapsed iron gates of the ancient burial site of Sancre Tor. Sai Sahan pushed aside the heavy iron gates of Sancre Tor. The rusted hinges ground loudly against the stone blocks, echoing down the dark corridors of the ancient burial site. Lyris Titanborn swept her double-bladed battle-axe through the thick webs covering the entrance, clearing the path into the central crypt. Varen Aquilarios walked past the collapsed pillars and the shattered stone coffins of the Reman emperors. He stepped onto a raised stone dais in the middle of the room. He reached into the accumulated dust and pulled out a heavy gold chain. A massive red diamond hung from the center of the links. The amulet of kings reflected the light of their torches, casting sharp red shapes against the cracked walls of the tomb. Mannimarco watched from the doorway. His pale fingers tapped a slow, steady rhythm against the side of his leg. He had guided the group across the continent for 2 full years, and the artifact now rested firmly in the Emperor's hands. The 5 companions rode their war horses back through the Colovian highlands. Their iron armor clattered with the steady trot of the mounts. They rode through the falling rain and the thick mud, crossing the central plains of Cyrodiil. They entered the high stone gates of the imperial city in the year 2E 579. The city guards pulled the heavy wooden doors of the Temple of the One open, allowing the group to step inside. The temple consisted of a wide, circular marble floor surrounded by towering stone columns. In the center of the room sat the stone braziers of the dragonfires, filled entirely with cold soot, grey ash, and the remnants of burned wood. Abnur unrolled a large parchment across a wooden stand, placing heavy iron weights on the corners to keep the paper flat. He traced the ink geometric patterns with his index finger, verifying the alignment of the ritual preparations. Lyris and Sai Sahan took their positions at the edges of the room, their hands resting on the leather hilts of their weapons. They watched the entrance and the shadows cast between the tall pillars. Varen stepped into the exact center of the marble circle. He draped the heavy gold chain over his neck, letting the red diamond rest against his iron breastplate. Mannimarco stood directly across from him, separated by the stone braziers. The arch-necromancer raised his pale hands, his long fingers pointing toward the vaulted ceiling. He chanted a series of deep, guttural syllables that vibrated the dust on the floor tiles. Varen closed his eyes and gripped the edges of the stone brazier. He recited the ancient oaths of the emperors, his voice booming across the empty temple. He demanded the dragon god Akatosh alter his blood, fill his veins with divine heritage, and ignite the cold ash in the braziers. He pushed his own magicka into the red diamond, his face sweating heavily from the intense physical exertion. A bright red light began to build inside the Amulet of Kings. The glow shifted rapidly. The red light twisted into a sickly, luminous green. The color of rotting seawater filled the temple, replacing the warm orange torchlight. Mannimarco dropped his hands from the ceiling and thrust them directly at Varen. A thick wave of black and green magicka shot from his palms. The energy wrapped around Varen's arms and chest, locking his joints in place. The magic expanded outward in a rapid, visible ring, striking Lyris, Sai Sahan, and Abnur. The 3 companions froze instantly, their muscles locked tightly under their armor. Lyris stood with her axe half-drawn, her jaw clenched tight, the veins pulsing prominently in her neck. Sai Sahan's hand stopped inches from his longsword. Abnur remained entirely stiff beside his wooden stand, his eyes darting side to side. Mannimarco stepped slowly across the marble floor. His dark leather boots clicked against the stone. He stopped directly in front of the paralyzed emperor. He looked at Varen's rigid, straining face. He spoke clearly, the sound bouncing off the high columns. He detailed his true allegiance. He declared his servitude to Molag Bal, the Daedric prince of domination and enslavement. He explained the exact nature of the spell currently twisting the amulet. He stated the ritual severed the ancient covenant between the divines and the mortal plane. He used Varen's own physical effort and the power of the amulet to shatter the protective barriers shielding Nirn from the realms of oblivion. The green light inside the Amulet of Kings expanded beyond the diamond. A massive surge of raw kinetic energy erupted from the stone. The explosion shattered the marble floor tiles and blasted the heavy wooden doors off their iron hinges. The wood splintered into thousands of pieces, flying into the courtyard. A shockwave of pure magicka swept out of the temple, ripping the clay roof tiles from the surrounding buildings and knocking citizens off their feet in the streets below. The sky above the imperial city tore open in a jagged line. The blue expanse fractured, revealing a swirling vortex of black clouds and purple lightning. The air pressure dropped drastically, popping the ears of anyone nearby. A sharp smell of sulfur and burning ozone blanketed the capital. The scholars and mages recording the physical destruction and the magical fallout of the event labeled this catastrophic explosion the Soul Burst. Inside the ruined temple, the blast wave consumed the center of the room. A column of blinding white and green fire engulfed Varan Aquilarios completely. The extreme heat melted the edges of the stone braziers, turning the rock into bubbling slag. The light snapped out, leaving a sudden, heavy darkness in the center of the room. The iron breastplate, the gold crown, and the emperor himself vanished entirely, leaving only a circle of scorched marble and smoking ash. The paralysis spell broke as the shockwave dissipated. Lyris Titanborn and Sai Sahan collapsed to the cracked floor, gasping for air, their armor scraping loudly against the broken tiles. The heavy gold chain of the Amulet of Kings hit the stone with a loud clatter, rolling to a stop near Sai Sahan's knee. Mannimarco remained standing through the blast, his dark robes free of ash or burns. He looked down at the two gasping warriors, while Abnur Than pushed himself up from the floor, his eyes darting between the standing arch-necromancer and the fallen red diamond. The smoke inside the Temple of the One cleared, leaving a thick layer of grey ash over the cracked marble floor. Only a pile of scorched metal and smoking dust remained where Varan Aquilarios previously stood. Mannimarco looked at the burned space and subsequently pointed his pale finger directly at Lyris Titanborn and Sai Sahan. He raised his voice over the sound of crumbling stone and declared the Emperor dead. He accused the two warriors of sabotaging the ritual and murdering Varan. Imperial guards rushed through the shattered wooden doorway, their steel boots sliding on the loose rubble. They pointed their iron-tipped spears at the Dragon Guard captain and the half-giant. Consequently, Mannimarco ordered the guards to arrest the traitors, citing their proximity to the brazier as absolute proof of their treason. Sai Sahan looked at the heavy gold chain resting on the broken tiles. He lunged forward, his chainmail scraping against the stone, and scooped the Amulet of Kings into his palm. Lyris Titanborn stepped in front of him, raising her double-bladed battle-axe with both hands. She swung the heavy steel weapon in a wide arc, forcing the approaching guards to jump back. She shouted at Sai Sahan, instructing him to take the red diamond far away from the capital. Sai Sahan secured the amulet inside his leather belt pouch. He turned and sprinted through the gap in the broken temple wall, dodging falling wooden beams. He ran through the dusty streets of the imperial city, pushing past coughing citizens and overturned merchant carts. He reached the city stables, mounted a large brown warhorse, and rode hard through the northern gates. He steered his mount toward the Colovian Mountains, retracing his path back to the ruined crypts of Sancre Tor to bury the artifact among the dead Reman emperors. Meanwhile, back in the temple, the imperial guards swarmed Lyris Titanborn. She struck two men with the wooden haft of her axe, sending them crashing into a stone pillar. Mannimarco raised his hands and projected a thick band of purple magicka. The energy wrapped tightly around Lyris's wrists and ankles, pulling her heavily to the ground. The guards moved in, fastening thick iron shackles over the magical bindings. Mannimarco watched her struggle against the chains, successfully securing his first high-value prisoner for the subterranean cells of his masters. Abnur brushed the grey soot from his crimson silk robes. He stepped carefully over the debris and walked to Mannimarco's side. The Imperial Chancellor looked at the shackled half-giant and the smoking braziers, calculating the shift in power. He extended his hand, displaying his heavy gold rings, and offered his complete allegiance to the arch-necromancer. Tharn intended to preserve his family's control over the imperial city and the surrounding provinces. He proposed an immediate alliance between the Imperial Legion and the Order of the Black Worm. Mannimarco accepted the offer, grasping Tharn's hand with his cold, pale fingers. Shortly afterward, the two men relocated to the Imperial Palace. They walked into the high-domed throne room. Clivia Tharn, the widow of Varan Aquilarios, sat on the ruby throne. She wore a heavy velvet gown and a tall, jeweled crown, acting as the newly established Empress Regent. Abnur Tharn stood beside his daughter, presenting Mannimarco as the chief advisor to the throne. Mannimarco outlined a formal pact between the ruling family and his cult. He demanded absolute access to the city's graveyards, the catacombs beneath the temples, and the prisons. In exchange, he offered a steady supply of obedient forces to maintain the Empress Regent's authority over the fracturing province. Clivia Tharn listened to the arch-necromancer's proposal. The imperial armies suffered massive casualties from the constant border skirmishes with rival warlords. The barracks held few men, and the recruitment officers struggled to find able-bodied soldiers willing to hold the city walls. Mannimarco stepped closer to the ruby throne and offered a direct solution to the military shortage. He promised to reinforce the imperial ranks using buried remains instead of living volunteers. He detailed his method, describing how his acolytes would travel to the recent battlefields outside the city gates. The worm cult would dig through the mud and mass graves, pulling the fallen imperial soldiers from the earth. Mannimarco stated he would infuse these dead men with stabilizing magicka, granting the Empress Regent an army of skeletal constructs and reanimated corpses equipped with standard steel armor and iron swords. Clivia Tharn nodded, granting her official royal decree to the necromancer. She signed the heavy parchment documents with red ink, sealing the agreement. Mannimarco took the rolled scrolls and walked out onto the high stone balcony of the palace. He looked down at the sprawling capital below. Plumes of black smoke rose from the damaged districts, and the green rift still swirled actively in the sky above the white gold tower. He summoned his highest-ranking acolytes, handing them the sealed documents. He instructed them to mobilize the entire Order of the Black Worm. The acolytes took the scrolls and descended into the city streets, preparing to turn the imperial capital into a mass harvesting ground and lay the physical foundations for a massive undead occupation. Mannimarco directed the acolytes of the worm cult to dig up the muddy fields outside the imperial city. They used heavy iron shovels to cut through the blood-soaked earth, uncovering the bodies of soldiers who had fallen in the recent border skirmishes. The necromancers dragged the corpses by their heavy leather boots, lining them up in long rows across the trampled grass. Mannimarco walked down the lines, placing a small, glowing purple soul gem onto the chest of each dead soldier. He chanted a short, rhythmic incantation, watching as the blue magicka seeped from the gems into the cold flesh. The corpses twitched and shuddered, their joints popping loudly as they pulled themselves up from the mud. They stood in rigid, silent ranks, holding rusted iron swords and dented wooden shields. Mannimarco marched this newly formed undead battalion directly through the main gates of the capital, presenting the soldiers to the imperial generals. The imperial officers inspected the silent troops, noting their lack of need for food, water, or sleep. The generals integrated the skeletal constructs and reanimated corpses into their standard patrols, using them to guard the city walls and fortify the military outposts across Cyrodiil. With the Empire relying on his undead forces, Mannimarco established a direct connection between the imperial city and his Dark Master. He ordered the remaining members of the Worm cult to empty the Temple of the One. The acolytes carried the broken marble floor tiles and the melted stone braziers out into the courtyard, leaving the central chamber completely bare. They brought in heavy iron chains, securing them to the base of the surviving stone columns. Mannimarco stood in the center of the cleared room, directly under the massive hole in the ceiling created by the soul burst. The swirling green rift in the sky cast a sickly light down onto his pale face. He raised his hands and began a prolonged, highly complex summoning ritual. He pulled raw magicka from the captured souls stored in his lower vaults, channeling the energy directly up into the rift. The green vortex expanded, spinning faster and generating a low, continuous rumble that shook the foundations of the city. Massive black chains, each link as thick as a horse's torso, dropped down from the rift. The dark iron plummeted through the sky, smashing into the stone walls of the imperial city and embedding themselves deep into the bedrock of Tamriel. These chains, known as dark anchors, pulled taut, physically tethering the mortal plane of Nirn to the Daedric realm of Cold Harbor. Mannimarco used the Temple of the One as a primary processing center. He instructed the imperial guards to bring him political dissidents, captured enemy combatants, and civilians who opposed the Empress Regent. The guards chained these prisoners to the iron rings on the temple columns. Mannimarco stood over them, his pale hands glowing with purple magicka. He forcefully extracted their souls, pushing the wisps of white light into crystalline gems, while their empty, physical bodies collapsed onto the stone floor. He then channeled the energy from the filled soul gems directly up through the dark anchors, feeding the massive magical tethers and pulling Nirn steadily closer to the realm of Molag Bal. The process, known as the plane meld, actively began tearing chunks of land and stone from the surface of Tamriel, dragging them upward into the sky. Abnor Tharn observed the entire process from the shadows of the temple. The imperial chancellor stood behind a wide stone pillar, his gold rings clicking softly against the marble surface. He watched Mannimarco rip the souls from the prisoners and studied the precise hand gestures and incantations used to fuel the dark anchors. Tharn maintained his position as an ally, providing Mannimarco with the necessary edicts and prisoners, while carefully documenting the arch-necromancer's specific methods and the exact flow of magicka within the temple. He compiled detailed notes in small leather-bound journals, hiding them in the deep pockets of his crimson silk robes. Tharn recognized the scale of the plane meld and sought to understand the mechanics of the Daedric machinery, positioning himself to exploit any weakness in Mannimarco's operation should the opportunity arise. Mannimarco stood within the center of the imperial city, directly beneath the massive green rift. He directed the worm cult to coordinate the physical logistics of the plane meld. The cultists drove wooden carts loaded with exhumed bodies from the battlefields to the base of the dark anchors. They threw the corpses onto the cracked marble floor of the temple. Mannimarco channeled his magicka, binding the fragmented souls back into the rotting vessels. These newly formed undead constructs dragged heavy iron chains and crude weaponry out of the temple, swelling the ranks of the Empress Regent's armies. With the capital secured under martial law, Mannimarco shifted his focus to the Amulet of Kings, fully intending to exploit the chaotic merger of realms for his own ascension. He held no loyalty to Molag Bal. He viewed the Daedric Prince of Domination simply as a massive reservoir of raw energy, entirely vulnerable due to the active tether between Cold Harbor and Nirn. He retreated into the subterranean levels of the Imperial Palace, locking the heavy oak doors behind him. He unrolled thick parchment scrolls across his wooden desk and mapped the exact magical frequencies flowing through the dark anchors. He calculated the absorption rate required to safely contain a Daedric entity. He hypothesized that the Amulet of Kings, originally forged to maintain the divine barriers of Mundus, possessed the necessary capacity to trap the essence of a Daedric prince. He documented a multi-stage ritual designed to invert the flow of the plane meld. Instead of pulling Nirn into Cold Harbor, the spell would channel Molag Bal's raw power down the iron chains, directly into the amulet, and subsequently into Mannimarco's own physical form. He instructed his acolytes to locate the amulet. He described the heavy gold chain and the large red diamond to his spies, ordering them to search every ruined fort and hidden vault across the provinces. He dispatched bands of worm cultists into the Colovian highlands, specifically targeting the ancient crypts of Sancre Tor. He knew Sai Sahan carried the artifact out of the capital, and he tracked the Red Guard's movements through the scattered reports of local mercenaries and paid informants. Mannimarco required the Red Diamond to act as the central conduit for his usurpation. He prepared the secondary components in his palace laboratory, grinding meteoric glass and mixing it with concentrated grave tar, ensuring the physical vessel of his own body could withstand the massive influx of divine energy. Abnur Tharn observed Mannimarco's distinct lack of communication with Cold Harbor. He noted the arch-necromancer's prolonged isolation in the lower vaults and the sudden redeployment of cultists toward the Colovian mountains. Tharn accessed the restricted Imperial archives, cross-referencing Mannimarco's requested materials with ancient texts regarding Daedric summoning. He identified the components for an inversion ritual. Tharn understood that Mannimarco intended to absorb Molag Bal, replacing the Daedric prince entirely. He realized that a successful usurpation would elevate the necromancer beyond any mortal control, rendering the Tharn family obsolete. Tharn carefully duplicated Mannimarco's notes and concealed the copies within his private chambers, preparing to leverage this information to protect his own position. Mannimarco remained entirely focused on his calculations. He stood in the damp cellar, holding a clear, uncharged soul gem. He channeled a fraction of the ambient energy leaking from the plane meld into the crystal. The gem vibrated violently and shattered into fine dust, cutting the skin on his palm. He brushed the glass shards off the wooden desk. He verified that only the Amulet of Kings possessed the structural integrity necessary for the final phase of his plan. He sent a direct order to his field commanders, demanding the immediate capture of Sai Sahan and the retrieval of the Red Diamond. He prepared to enact the final sequence of his betrayal, aiming to pull the God of Schemes down from his throne and absorb his dominion completely. The acolytes of the Worm cult tracked Sai Sahan across the Colovian highlands. They pursued the Red Guard captain through dense pine forests and over steep, rocky inclines. Heavy rain turned the mountain paths into thick, shifting mud, slowing his heavy warhorse. The cultists surrounded him in a narrow gorge, holding iron-tipped spears and wooden crossbows. They fired steel bolts into the flanks of the horse, bringing the massive animal down onto the wet rocks. Sai Sahan drew his curved longsword and severed the wooden shafts of the spears, cutting down 3 of the acolytes. Consequently, a high-ranking necromancer standing on the ridge above channeled a burst of purple magicka into the back of Sai Sahan's iron helmet. The concussive force cracked the metal and knocked the captain unconscious. The cultists bound his wrists and ankles with thick hemp ropes, dragging his limp body over the stones and loading him onto a wooden supply cart. Mannimarco received the captive in the imperial city and immediately ordered the Daedric guards to transport the Dragon Guard captain into a specialized pocket realm of Cold Harbor known as the Halls of Torment. Mannimarco walked through the heavy black smoke of the Halls of Torment. The architecture consisted of sharp basalt pillars and grates venting orange fire from the floors below. The air smelled entirely of burning hair and hot iron. The Daedric guards turned large wooden wheels attached to the walls, pulling heavy steel chains taut. Sai Sahan hung suspended in the center of the room, the chains wrapped tightly around his wrists and pulling his arms horizontally. His muscles spasmed, and the joints in his shoulders popped loudly under the extreme mechanical tension. Mannimarco stood directly in front of the captive, holding a curved scalpel forged from black volcanic glass. He pressed the sharp edge against Sai Sahan's collarbone, slicing a thin line through the skin. Dark red blood dripped down the Redguard's chest and pooled on the heated stone floor, hissing as it boiled away. Mannimarco channeled raw blue magicka into his fingertips and pressed them directly into the open wound. He searched the electrical impulses of the man's brain, demanding the exact location of the red diamond. Sai Sahan clenched his jaw, grinding his teeth together, and spit a mixture of saliva and blood onto the necromancer's dark leather boots. Meanwhile, outside the pocket realm, Mannimarco maintained his daily quotas at the Temple of the One. He ascended the cracked marble steps to the central altar. The cultists forced an unknown prisoner onto the flat stone slab, pressing heavy iron braces over the victim's forearms. Mannimarco raised an obsidian dagger high above his head and drove the jagged tip directly through the prisoner's sternum. He twisted the handle, fracturing the ribs, and pulled a sphere of bright white light from the chest cavity. He pressed the glowing light into a clear crystal soul gem resting on a brass pedestal. The crystal shifted immediately to a deep, cloudy purple, vibrating against the metal base. The cultists unlatched the iron braces, grabbed the limp arms and legs of the corpse, and threw the empty physical shell directly into the swirling green rift above the capital. The physical shell tumbled through the void between realms and crashed heavily into a pool of glowing blue liquid in the wastelands of Cold Harbor. The viscous fluid, known as azure plasm, reacted instantly to the sudden impact. The blue liquid crawled up the limbs of the shattered corpse. It solidified into hard white bone, weaving new red muscle fibers over the fractures and sealing the entire structure in fresh, pale skin. The prisoner inhaled sharply, pulling the scent of sulfur and cold grey ash into their newly formed lungs. They opened their eyes and pushed themselves up from the pool, standing barefoot on the jagged black rocks. They walked toward a fallen Daedric guard, picking up a heavy iron longsword from the dirt. They swung the heavy blade against the rusted iron bars of the surrounding enclosure, fracturing the metal and stepping out into the open grey wasteland. The newly reformed prisoner walked past pools of boiling tar and towering spikes of black glass. They located a massive iron wall at the edge of a deep ravine. Lyris Titanborn hung from the wall, her wrists bound by thick steel cuffs bolted directly into the metal surface. The prisoner raised the iron longsword and struck the cuffs repeatedly with heavy, overhead swings. The steel shattered, sending bright yellow sparks flying across the dark stone. Lyris dropped heavily to the ground, rubbing the deep red bruises on her wrists. She scanned the debris and picked up a double-bladed iron battle-axe resting near a collapsed pillar. The two warriors sprinted across a bridge constructed from floating, fractured stone blocks. They located a portal of shifting blue light suspended in the air. They jumped through the glowing tier, leaving the cold ash of Cold Harbor behind and landing directly on the wet grass of mainland Tamriel. Furthermore, the prisoner and the half-giant traveled through the forested hills to locate the hidden sanctuary of Abnor Tharn. They gathered the Imperial Chancellor and organized a direct physical assault to retrieve the Dragon Guard captain. The group activated a localized portal stone and stepped back into the heavy black smoke of the Halls of Torment. They marched down the dark basalt corridors in a tight formation, stepping over the burning coals. Lyris gripped her battle-axe with both hands, the steel blades catching the reflection of the ambient fire. They approached the heavy iron double doors of the central chamber. Lyris lunged forward and swung her weapon, driving the thick metal edge into the center of the doors. The iron hinges buckled and tore away from the stone frame, revealing Mannimarco standing directly over the bleeding body of Sai Sahan. The companions raised their weapons and charged across the heated floor tiles, preparing to separate the arch-necromancer from his captive by sheer physical force. Mannimarco turned away from the bleeding Red Guard. He raised his hands toward the broken iron doors as Lyris Titanborn, the unknown prisoner, and Abnor Tharn stepped into the chamber. Lyris swung her heavy battle-axe horizontally, aiming directly for Mannimarco's neck. The arch-necromancer stepped back, allowing the steel blade to cut through the air inches from his throat. He brought his hands together, generating a concentrated sphere of purple magicka. He launched the spell directly into the center of the group, intending to paralyze them entirely. Abnor Tharn stepped in front of the sphere. He raised his own wooden staff and cast a solid, golden barrier of protective light. The purple magicka struck the golden shield with a loud crack, shattering the barrier, but dissipating entirely before it could touch the companions. Tharn held his ground, his rings sparking with residual energy, and instructed Lyris and the prisoner to retrieve Sai Sahan. Mannimarco glared at the Imperial Chancellor, his pale eyes narrowing. He recognized Tharn's betrayal immediately. He summoned two towering skeletal constructs from the heated stone floor, their bones blackened by the ambient fire of the Daedric realm. The constructs raised rusted iron greatswords and charged at the companions. The prisoner stepped forward, lifting their scavenged iron longsword. They struck the first skeleton across the kneecaps, shattering the brittle bone and dropping the construct to the floor. Lyris brought her battle-axe down in a heavy, vertical strike, cleaving the skull of the second skeleton entirely in half. While the warriors dismantled his guards, Mannimarco prepared a highly lethal spell, his hands glowing with a dense green light. Abnor Tharn struck first. He channeled a continuous stream of pure fire from his staff, engulfing Mannimarco. The flames seared the necromancer's dark robes and pushed him physically backward, forcing him to drop the green spell to protect his own skin. With Mannimarco temporarily pinned by the fire, Lyris ran to the center of the room. She grabbed the heavy steel chains binding Sai Sahan's wrists and pulled backward with her massive strength. The wooden wheels attached to the walls splintered and snapped under the pressure, releasing the tension. Sai Sahan dropped heavily onto the hot stones, gasping for air and holding his bleeding collarbone. The prisoner grabbed the Dragon Guard captain by his chainmail and hoisted him to his feet. Abnur Tharn ceased his fire spell, his staff smoking heavily in his hands. He shouted for the group to fall back toward the localized portal stone. Mannimarco extinguished the remaining flames on his robes, his pale skin singed and covered in grey soot. He watched the group drag Sai Sahan through the blue rift, retreating from the halls of torment and taking the only person who knew the location of the Amulet of Kings directly out of his grasp. Mannimarco returned to the imperial city. The heavy iron chains of the dark anchors still pulled taut against the stone walls, but the loss of the Red Guard captain significantly delayed his plans for ascension. He walked into his subterranean laboratory beneath the palace. He kicked a wooden stool across the room, the wood splintering against the stone wall. He unrolled his detailed maps of Cyrodiil and placed small bone markers on every known exit point from Cold Harbor. He knew Tharn possessed his duplicated notes. He realized the Imperial Chancellor understood the mechanics of the usurpation ritual and the necessity of the amulet. He ordered his worm cultists to double their patrols along the Colovian borders and the roads leading to Sancre Tor. He instructed them to kill Lyris Titanborn, the unknown prisoner, and Abnur Tharn on sight, but to capture Sai Sahan alive at any cost. He established direct communication with the remaining imperial generals loyal to the Empress Regent. He directed them to deploy the undead battalions to block the mountain passes. The skeletal constructs and reanimated soldiers formed solid, unmoving lines across the dirt roads, holding their iron shields locked together. Mannimarco stood over his stone table, his hands resting flat against the cold surface. He analyzed the physical layout of the continent and the exact distance between the capital and the ancient tombs. He calculated that Sai Sahan, bleeding and exhausted, would require time to recover before attempting to retrieve the hidden artifact. He resolved to tighten the perimeter around Sancre Tor, preparing to ambush the companions the moment they arrived to unearth the red diamond. Sai Sahan recovered his strength inside the hidden sanctuary of Abnur Tharn. He secured a heavy iron longsword to his belt and fastened new layers of steel chainmail over his chest. Lyris Titanborn sharpened the blades of her battle axe with a rough whetstone, checking the heavy leather grips wrapped around the wooden haft. The unknown prisoner stood nearby, securing a steel shield to their left arm. The companions activated a localized portal stone, pushing through the shifting blue light and arriving directly inside the ruined central chamber of Sancre Tor. The heavy iron gates hung completely open, and the scattered bones of the Reman emperors lay fractured across the stone floor. Mannimarco stood waiting at the far end of the crypt. He wore his dark robes, his pale hands resting flat against the surface of a raised stone dais. He turned his head and watched the companions step over the rubble. Mannimarco raised his hands and slammed them down onto the stone dais. A pulse of concentrated purple magicka expanded outward, filling the crypt with thick black smoke. He channeled energy directly into the stone coffins, forcing the buried remains of the Colovian kings to pull themselves up from the dirt. The skeletal constructs carried heavy iron greatswords and rusted brass shields, their joints scraping loudly against the stone. Mannimarco directed the undead soldiers to form a solid wall of bone and steel between himself and the companions. He then focused his attention directly on Sai Sahan. He raised his index finger and projected a narrow, highly concentrated beam of green energy. The beam bypassed the skeletal line entirely and struck Sai Sahan square in the chest. The magical force threw the Redguard backward, knocking him onto the cracked floor and pinning him under the weight of the spell. Lyris Titanborn charged into the line of skeletons. She swung her battle axe in wide, sweeping arcs, shattering the brittle bone and denting the brass shields. The unknown prisoner followed closely behind, using their steel shield to deflect the heavy iron swords. They pushed through the center of the undead formation, breaking the line and stepping into the clear space near the stone dais. Mannimarco dropped the beam of green energy, releasing Sai Sahan, and pulled a curved obsidian dagger from his belt. The prisoner lunged forward and struck Mannimarco across the jaw with the heavy iron rim of their shield. The impact snapped the necromancer's head back and knocked the dagger from his hand. The obsidian blade clattered across the stone floor, coming to a rest near the base of a shattered pillar. Mannimarco stumbled backward, wiping a thin line of black blood from his lip. He raised both hands, preparing a massive area of effect spell designed to collapse the ceiling of the crypt. Abnur Tharn stepped out from the shadows near the entrance. He held a glowing wooden staff and directed a focused stream of pure sunlight directly at Mannimarco. The concentrated light struck the arch-necromancer's chest, burning his dark robes and disrupting his magicka flow entirely. Mannimarco fell to his knees, his hands dropping to the floor. The prisoners stepped forward, raising their iron longsword high above their head. They brought the blade down directly through Mannimarco's collarbone, driving the steel deep into his chest cavity. The necromancer's body jerked violently, his pale eyes rolling back in his head. The physical shell collapsed onto the cracked stone tiles, the purple magicka rapidly fading from his skin. With Mannimarco's physical body incapacitated, Sai Sahan approached the raised stone dais. He reached into the loose dirt and pulled out a heavy gold chain. He held up the massive red diamond of the Amulet of Kings, securing it tightly inside his leather belt pouch. The companions regrouped near the entrance of the crypt, leaving the empty shell of the arch-necromancer lying on the floor. They pushed the broken iron gates aside and stepped out into the cold mountain air. They located their war horses tied to a nearby pine tree and rode quickly down the rocky pass, carrying the artifact away from the Colovian highlands. Inside the crypt, Mannimarco's physical body dissolved entirely into grey ash. The dark magicka stored within his form expanded outward, carrying his actual soul directly into the swirling void between realms. The soul traveled rapidly along the iron chains of the dark anchors, bypassing the mortal plane and landing directly within the central fortress of Cold Harbor. Molag Bal stood waiting in the center of the Daedric citadel. The massive Prince of Domination looked down at the dark, translucent spirit of the arch-necromancer. He recognized the attempted usurpation and the failure at Sancre Tor. He raised a massive clawed hand, preparing to exact his punishment directly upon the soul of the King of Worms. Molag Bal looked down at the dark, translucent spirit of the arch-necromancer. The Daedric Prince of Domination towered over the soul, his massive horned head scraping the jagged basalt ceiling of the central citadel. He extended his right hand, revealing long, curved talons coated in dried black blood. He closed his fingers tightly around Mannimarco's spirit. The necromancer's soul warped and stretched under the physical pressure, emitting a high-pitched, vibrating sound similar to cracking glass. Molag Bal walked out of the central chamber and approached a sheer cliff overlooking the vast, grey wastelands of Cold Harbor. He held the trapped soul over the edge. He declared that treason required a permanent physical demonstration of Daedric authority. He dropped the soul directly into the swirling void below the cliff, sending Mannimarco plummeting toward a massive, spiked torture wheel constructed entirely of cold iron and rusted gears. The soul slammed into the center of the wheel, immediately binding to the metal spokes. The gears shifted, turning the massive iron structure slowly over a pit of burning blue azure plasm. Mannimarco's spirit strained against the bindings, the translucent purple energy stretching thin across the rusted metal. The ambient cold of the realm pressed against him, freezing the edges of his soul and locking him in a state of continuous, agonizing stasis. He hung suspended over the boiling liquid, watching the lower Daedra drag fresh mortal souls from the active dark anchors. He calculated the duration of his torment, recognizing the physical reality of Daedric retribution. He watched the plane meld continue without his guidance, the massive iron chains still pulling chunks of Tamriel into the grey sky. He focused his remaining magicka entirely inward, compacting his essence to endure the slow rotation of the wheel and the intense heat of the blue fire below. Meanwhile, back on Nirn, the companions rode through the heavy rain of the Colovian highlands. Sai Sahan kept the leather pouch secured tightly against his chainmail, shielding the red diamond from the elements. The group avoided the main roads, utilizing narrow hunting trails to bypass the undead battalions Mannimarco had deployed. They reached the hidden sanctuary of Abnor Tharn just before dawn. Tharn reviewed his copied notes, calculating the structural damage done to the planar barriers by the soulburst. He stated that the Amulet of Kings possessed enough stored energy to perform a completely different ritual. He proposed using the red diamond to directly empower a single mortal vessel with the raw divine energy of Akatosh. He argued this empowered individual could physically confront Molag Bal, sever the dark anchors, and force the Daedric prince to release his grip on the mortal plane entirely. The companions agreed to the proposal, recognizing it as the only viable method to halt the plane meld. They spent weeks preparing the physical components, drawing complex golden sigils on the floor of the sanctuary using crushed meteoric glass. Sai Sahan placed the Amulet of Kings in the center of the sigils. The red diamond pulsed steadily, reacting to the ambient magicka in the room. The unknown prisoner stood directly over the artifact, while Tharn, Lyris, and Sai Sahan took positions at the outer edges of the circle. Abnor Tharn raised his wooden staff and began the incantation, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The red diamond flared brightly, releasing a concentrated stream of pure golden light directly into the chest of the prisoner. The divine energy flooded their veins, completely overcharging their physical form and surrounding them in a solid aura of blinding hot light. The prisoner grabbed their iron longsword, the steel blade glowing white-hot, and activated the localized portal stone, stepping directly into the center of Cold Harbor. The empowered prisoner marched across the grey wasteland. They swung the white-hot sword, cutting completely through the iron shields and heavy armor of the Daedric guards. They shattered the basalt pillars and collapsed the guard towers, leaving a trail of burning rubble behind them. They approached the central citadel, confronting Molag Bal directly. The Daedric prince swung a massive iron mace, aiming to crush the mortal into the dirt. The prisoner raised their shield, blocking the strike. The impact sent a shockwave across the wasteland, cracking the stone beneath their feet. The prisoner thrust the glowing sword forward, driving the blade deep into Molag Bal's chest. The divine energy from the amulet flared, pushing the Daedric prince backward and forcing him to release his physical hold on the active dark anchors. The massive iron chains snapped loudly, the thick links breaking apart and falling into the blue pits of azure plasm. The green rift in the sky above the imperial city collapsed inward, sealing the tier between the realms. Molagbal roared, the sound vibrating the cracked stones of his citadel, as his physical form temporarily dissolved into the surrounding shadows. The plane meld halted immediately, the severed chains leaving deep, permanent craters across the landscape of Tamriel. During the chaos of the confrontation, the massive spiked wheel holding Mannimarco shattered. The iron spokes broke apart, dropping the arch-necromancer's soul directly onto the cold stone floor. Mannimarco pulled his essence together, drawing the purple magicka tight against his form. He did not attempt to join the battle. He turned away from the collapsing citadel and the blinding golden light of the empowered prisoner. He moved quickly through the shadows of the grey wasteland, locating an unstable, localized tear in the fabric of the realm created by the severing of the anchors. He pushed his soul directly into the fissure, escaping Cold Harbor entirely, before the Daedric prince could reform his physical body and re-establish control over his prisoners. Mannimarco re-entered the mortal plane. His soul pulled raw magicka from the ambient atmosphere, slowly reforming his physical body. The process took months. He reconstructed his bones, muscle tissue, and pale skin within the dark confines of an abandoned cavern deep in the Dragontail Mountains. When the physical reconstruction finished, he walked out of the cave. He wore simple grey robes, blending in with the common travelers on the dirt roads of Cyrodiil. He discovered the empire he had manipulated was entirely gone. In the years following his defeat at Sancre Tor and his escape from Cold Harbor, a new warlord named Tiber Septim had marched across the continent. Septim used heavy iron legions and a massive brass golem known as the Numidium to conquer every province, establishing the Third Empire and ending the interregnum completely. Mannimarco walked through the bustling markets of the imperial city. The heavy iron chains of the dark anchors were entirely removed. The Temple of the One had been fully rebuilt, its marble floors polished, and its wooden doors replaced. The dragon fires burned brightly in the central braziers, casting a warm orange light across the stone columns. The priests of Akatosh and Arche walked the streets freely, wearing clean white robes and carrying silver censers. Mannimarco observed the stability of the new era. He realized direct, massive confrontation would no longer work against a unified, heavily militarized empire. He retreated to the edges of the provinces, returning to the damp cellars, isolated crypts, and hidden swamps where the Order of the Black Worm still operated in secrecy. For centuries, Mannimarco kept his followers hidden. He communicated through encrypted parchment scrolls and dead drops located in empty mausoleums. He slowly rebuilt the physical resources of his cult, amassing large stockpiles of grave tar, soul gems, and exhumed remains. He expanded his influence quietly, placing spies within the local mages' guilds and the regional courts. He tracked the lineage of the Septim dynasty, watching the emperors sit on the ruby throne while he operated entirely in the shadows. He recognized that true ascension required a different approach, one that did not rely on the unpredictable nature of Daedric princes or the direct manipulation of massive geopolitical conflicts. Eventually, Mannimarco discovered the existence of the mantella. This massive, glowing green gem served as the core power source for the Numidium, the brass golem Tiber Septim had used to conquer Tamriel. The gem contained a massive concentration of soul energy, specifically the soul of an incredibly powerful underking. Mannimarco studied the ancient schematics of the brass golem, calculating the exact magical output of the mantella. He determined that the gem held enough raw power to fuel his ascension directly, without the need for complex Daedric rituals or vulnerable conduits like the Amulet of Kings. He focused the entire operational capacity of the worm cult on locating the mantella, preparing to extract the massive soul energy for his own specific design. During the late Third Era, specifically in the year 3E405, Mannimarco established a primary base of operations in the Iliac Bay region, situated between the provinces of High Rock and Hammerfell. He directed his acolytes to construct a massive subterranean laboratory hidden deep within the Dragontail Mountains, known as the Scourge Barrow. The cavern complex featured high-vaulted ceilings, large stone work tables, and deep pits filled with boiling alchemical fluids. Mannimarco operated from this central location, expanding his network of spies and informants into the royal courts of Daggerfall, Wayrest, and Sentinel. He utilized his spies to monitor the political instability of the region. He learned that the ghost of the former king of Daggerfall haunted the city streets, and that the Emperor Uriel Septim VII had dispatched a personal agent to investigate the spectral disturbance. Mannimarco recognized the arrival of the Emperor's agent as a direct opportunity. He knew the agent possessed the political authority and the physical capability to navigate the complex regional conflicts and potentially locate the mantella. He instructed his highest-ranking cultists to carefully monitor the agent's movements, preparing to intercept the operative and utilize them to secure the massive green gem for the Order of the Black Worm. Mannimarco waited in the Scourge Barrow. He paced the length of the subterranean vault, his boots scraping against the cold stone floor. He reviewed the missives delivered by his spies in Daggerfall. The reports indicated the Emperor's agent had successfully navigated the political tension between the Iliac Bay kingdoms. The agent located the mantella, the massive green soul gem, within the ethereal plane of Mantellan Crux. Mannimarco traced the coordinates on his heavy parchment map. He noted the agent's return to the mortal plane and their possession of the artifact. He did not dispatch his cultists to attack the agent directly. Instead, he drafted a formal letter, sealing it with the black wax insignia of the worm cult. He instructed his courier to deliver the letter directly to the agent, offering a massive sum of gold and the absolute loyalty of the Order in exchange for the mantella. He understood the nature of the Numidium. The brass golem stood hundreds of feet tall, its joints constructed from massive Dwemer gears and thick metal plating. Activating the golem required the specific soul energy contained within the mantella. The Emperor, the Underking, and the various warlords of the Iliac Bay all desired the artifact to fuel the mechanical giant for their own political conquests. Mannimarco wanted the gem for its raw magicka. He knew the concentrated soul energy within the mantella possessed enough force to elevate a mortal to divine status, bypassing the established cycle of the Aedra and Daedra entirely. He instructed his acolytes to clear the central chamber of the Scourge Barrow. They pushed the heavy stone tables against the walls and swept the bone dust from the floor. Mannimarco stood in the center of the empty space, calculating the exact absorption rate required to safely consume the energy of the Underking without obliterating his own physical form. The Emperor's agent received the missive. They traveled across the Dragontail Mountains, navigating the steep, snowy passes. They located the hidden entrance to the Scourge Barrow and descended into the damp, torchlit caverns. The agent walked past the skeletal constructs, standing guard in the narrow corridors. They entered the central vault and approached Mannimarco. The agent carried the mantella, wrapped tightly in a thick linen cloth. Mannimarco stood by a large iron brazier, the fire casting sharp shadows across his pale, sunken face. He extended his cold hand, offering the agreed payment. The agent unwrapped the cloth, revealing the massive green gem. The mantella pulsed with a bright, erratic light, illuminating the dark corners of the cavern and emitting a low, continuous hum that vibrated the stone floor. The agent placed the artifact directly into Mannimarco's hand. The instant his fingers touched the gem, the physical reality of the Dragontail Mountains shattered. The massive influx of energy triggered a localized dragon break. The fabric of time fractured into multiple, simultaneous timelines. The air inside the Skorg barrow distorted, rippling violently. Mannimarco did not activate the Numidium. He channeled the entire reserve of soul energy directly into his own chest. The green light flared, blinding the agent and completely engulfing the arch-necromancer. The sheer force of the magicka dissolved his physical body entirely. His bones turned to white dust, and his pale skin evaporated into the air. The energy pushed his soul upward, breaking through the stone ceiling of the cavern and tearing directly into the night sky above Tamriel. The citizens of the Iliac Bay looked up at the fractured sky. They saw the stars shift out of alignment. A new celestial body formed in the dark expanse. A small, pale moon materialized in the sky, orbiting the larger, established planets. The scholars and mages observing the event labeled this new orbital body the Necromancer's Moon. Mannimarco successfully utilized the chaotic energy of the dragon break to ascend, establishing himself as a permanent fixture in the heavens. The light from his moon bathed the graveyards and burial sites of Tamriel in a sickly, pale glow, providing a direct, physical conduit for his followers to bypass the protective wards of Arche and draw raw magicka directly from his new divine form. The temporal fracture of the dragon break separated the arch-necromancer into two distinct entities. The newly formed necromancer's moon orbited the planet, casting a heavy purple glow over the clouds. Below the sky, the physical body of Mannimarco stepped onto the sharp rocks of the Jural Mountains in the northern reaches of Cyrodiil. His leather boots crunched through the deep, packed snow. He walked into the dark opening of Echo Cave, pulling his grey cloak tightly around his shoulders. The temperature inside the cavern plunged rapidly, freezing the condensation on the jagged limestone stalactites. Consequently, Mannimarco directed his remaining acolytes to construct a high throne from polished femurs and iron spikes over a frozen underground river. He established this frozen vault as the primary staging ground for the Order of the Black Worm, preparing to reclaim his physical dominance over the central province. Meanwhile, inside the stone walls of the Arcane University in the Imperial City, Archmage Hannibal Traven sat behind a heavy oak desk. He dipped a brass-tipped quill into a jar of black ink and wrote a series of strict mandates across thick rolls of parchment. He pressed his heavy brass signet ring into pools of hot red wax, officially sealing the documents. The mandates explicitly outlawed the handling of bone dust, the possession of black iron mortuary tools, and the chanting of all reanimation spells within the guild halls. Guild porters placed the heavy scrolls into leather satchels and rode out across the province on armored warhorses. They nailed the edicts to the wooden notice boards in every city square. Furthermore, Imperial guards and senior mages stormed the private quarters of suspected necromancers. They carried wooden crates filled with human skulls, rusted scalpels, and glass jars of murky alchemical fluids into the open stone courtyards. The guards threw the confiscated materials into massive bonfires, sending thick plumes of white smoke and the sharp smell of burning bone drifting over the city walls. The acolytes of the worm cult retreated from the cities and traveled to the frozen depths of Echo Cave. They knelt on the ice-covered floor and reported the confiscations and the burning of their tools to Mannimarco. The arch-necromancer listened to the reports, his pale fingers gripping the armrests of his bone throne. He stood up and instructed his followers to gather clear quartz soul gems from the surrounding caves. He marched the cultists out of the cavern and into the snow-covered pine forests. They located ruined stone altars hidden beneath the dense tree canopy. They waited for the thick clouds to part, allowing the direct purple light of the necromancer's moon to shine through the branches. Subsequently, the cultists placed the clear quartz gems directly onto the cracked stone slabs. The purple light struck the crystals, saturating the minerals completely. The quartz darkened rapidly, shifting into pitch-black obsidian. The surface of these newly forged black soul gems grew freezing cold, drawing moisture from the air and forming a thin layer of frost over the jagged edges. These dark gems possessed the specific capacity to trap the souls of sentient elves and humans. Mannimarco armed his acolytes with heavy sacks of the freezing black soul gems. He distributed wooden staffs topped with sharp black iron spikes and instructed the cultists to march directly toward the mountain city of Bruma. The acolytes walked through the heavy snowdrifts, their black robes dragging through the white powder. They approached the local mages' guild hall, an imposing structure built from heavy timber and thick stone blocks. The cultists raised their iron staffs and channeled concentrated bursts of green magicka at the building. The magical force shattered the large glass windows, sending thousands of sharp fragments scattering across the snow. They kicked the thick oak doors off their iron hinges and swarmed into the main reception room. Inside the guild hall, the cultists threw glass vials filled with volatile alchemical liquids. The vials shattered against the wooden bookshelves, igniting instantly. Bright orange flames consumed the heavy leather-bound tomes and the rolled parchment scrolls. The air filled with the suffocating smell of burning paper and scorching timber. The local mages rushed into the room, raising their hands and casting solid blue barriers of protective light. The cultists struck the barriers with their iron spikes, cracking the magical shields and knocking the scholars to the wooden floorboards. The necromancers pressed the freezing black soul gems directly against the chests of the fallen mages. They chanted guttural syllables, forcefully tearing the bright white light of the scholars' souls directly through their ribs and locking the energy inside the black crystals. The fire spread rapidly, collapsing the wooden roof beams of the guild hall and sending thick black smoke billowing into the winter sky. The cultists walked out of the burning structure, leaving the empty, drained physical shells of the mages lying among the charred debris. A single guild porter survived the assault by hiding beneath a heavy stone stairwell. He crawled through the scattered glass and the smoking wood, blood dripping from a deep cut on his shoulder. He grabbed the reins of a panicked horse tied to a nearby post and pulled himself onto the leather saddle. He secured a dropped black soul gem and a torn piece of a cultist's robe inside his tunic. He kicked his boots into the horse's flanks and rode rapidly south along the paved cobblestone roads, carrying the physical evidence of the massacre directly toward the high stone walls of the imperial city to deliver the warning to Archmage Traven. The guild porter from the Bruma massacre rode his exhausted horse over the stone bridge and passed through the high iron gates of the imperial city. Foam dripped from the horse's mouth, and its iron horseshoes struck the cobblestones heavily. The porter slid off the leather saddle and ran across the open courtyard of the arcane university. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the central tower and climbed the spiral stone staircase. He entered the private quarters of Archmage Hannibal Traven. The porter dropped a heavy, freezing black crystal and a torn piece of charred black cloth onto Traven's polished wooden desk. Dark red blood dripped from a deep laceration on the porter's shoulder, staining the floorboards. Traven instructed the healers to take the porter to the infirmary. He picked up the jagged black crystal. A layer of white frost immediately formed across his fingers. He rotated the gem, observing the dark purple light trapped inside the obsidian structure. He recognized the specific magical signature embedded in the crystal. He identified the physical manifestation of the King of Worms operating on the mortal plane. The chaotic temporal fracture of the dragon break had divided the arch-necromancer into two distinct forms. The massive green energy of the mantella elevated a portion of his soul into the sky, creating the pale, orbiting necromancer's moon. At the exact same time, his physical mortal body remained anchored to Nirn. This mortal avatar retained all of his knowledge and magical prowess. It sat on a throne of polished bone in the freezing depths of Echo Cave, actively commanding the worm cult and coordinating the coordinated strikes against the Mages Guild. Traven placed the black soul gem back onto his desk. He wiped the frost from his hands. He understood that the arch-necromancer sought to absorb the souls of the senior guild members to fuel a massive undead army. Traven summoned the Council of Mages to the central chamber of the university. 6 senior battle mages walked into the room, their heavy blue robes brushing against the stone floor. They carried tall wooden staffs capped with glowing crystals. Traven placed the black soul gem on a brass pedestal in the center of the room. The cold, radiating from the gem, lowered the temperature of the entire chamber, causing the mages to pull their cloaks tighter around their shoulders. Traven pointed at the frozen crystal. He detailed the destruction of the Bruma Guildhall and the specific soul-trapping mechanics of the new gems. He ordered the battle mages to construct defensive wards around the remaining guild structures across Cyrodiil. He assigned a newly promoted spellsword, the guild's most capable operative, to launch a direct physical assault on Echo Cave. Traven knew Mannimarco possessed a specific spell designed to rip the soul from a mortal body upon visual contact. He required a specialized countermeasure to shield the operative from this immediate extraction. He descended the narrow stone steps into the restricted lower vaults of the arcane university. He pulled heavy leather-bound tomes from the dusty shelves and unrolled wide parchment schematics across a stone workbench. The ink diagrams detailed the construction of a colossal black soul gem, a crystal massive enough to absorb the necromancer's extraction spell without shattering. Traven gathered 4 master enchanters in the lower forge. They placed dozens of standard, empty grand soul gems into a thick iron crucible. They channeled continuous streams of highly concentrated fire magicka under the crucible, melting the crystals into a glowing, viscous liquid. The enchanters poured the boiling liquid crystal into a massive, faceted iron mold. They immediately cast dense blasts of frost magicka over the iron, rapidly cooling the liquid. The sudden temperature drop solidified the material into a single, massive black gem, the size of a human skull. Traven lifted the heavy gem from the mold using a pair of iron tongs. He carried the colossal black soul gem back up the spiral staircase and placed it in the center of his private quarters. He locked the heavy oak doors and drew the iron deadbolts. He retrieved a sharp steel dagger from his belt and held it tightly in his right hand. He required a fully charged soul of massive power to fill the crystal and activate its protective properties. Traven channeled his own magicka, casting a binding soul trap spell directly onto his own physical form. He raised the steel dagger and drove the blade deeply into his own chest. His physical body collapsed onto the wooden floorboards. A massive sphere of blinding white light pulled away from his chest cavity and sank directly into the facets of the colossal black soul gem. The crystal absorbed the energy, shifting from pitch black to a deep, luminous purple. The heavy gem vibrated continuously against the wooden desk, radiating an intense, biting cold. The assigned operative walked up the spiral staircase and broke the iron deadbolts with the heavy pommel of their steel longsword. They pushed the splintered doors open and entered the room. They found the Archmage's empty physical shell lying on the floor. They picked up the vibrating purple crystal from the desk and wrapped it tightly in thick layers of heavy wool. They secured the wrapped gem inside their leather pack. The operative strapped a large iron shield to their left arm and walked out of the arcane university. They mounted an armored warhorse and rode north along the paved cobblestone roads, carrying the soul of Hannibal Traven directly toward the snow-covered peaks of the Jural Mountains to confront the mortal avatar of the King of Worms. The Mages Guild operative rode hard through the Jural Mountains. They navigated the steep, rocky inclines and pushed their exhausted warhorse through the heavy snowdrifts. They located the dark, jagged entrance to Echo Cave and dismounted, securing the animal to a frozen pine branch. The operative drew their steel longsword and strapped the heavy iron shield to their left arm. They unfastened the leather pack and pulled out the colossal black soul gem. The purple crystal vibrated violently, the stored energy of Archmage Traven reacting to the proximity of the Archnecromancer's physical avatar. The operative stepped into the dark cavern, the cold air freezing the condensation on their iron armor. They walked past the scattered bone fragments and empty glass jars left by the fleeing cultists. They entered the central subterranean chamber and found Mannimarco sitting on the high throne of polished femurs. Mannimarco looked down from the bone throne. He wore his simple grey robes, his pale hands resting flat against the spiked armrests. He focused his pale eyes entirely on the operative. He recognized the heavy iron armor and the crest of the arcane university stamped on the steel shield. He raised his right hand and pointed his index finger directly at the operative's chest. He chanted a single harsh syllable, channeling a massive burst of purple magicka intended to instantly rip the mortal soul from the operative's body. The magical force struck the operative directly in the breastplate. The colossal black soul gem hidden beneath the iron armor flared brightly. The massive energy of Hannibal Traven absorbed the extraction spell entirely, shielding the operative's soul from the Archnecromancer's pull. Mannimarco stared at his hand. He realized the spell had failed. He stood up from the bone throne and drew a curved obsidian dagger from beneath his grey robes. The operative charged across the frozen underground river, their iron boots slipping slightly on the smooth ice. They swung the steel longsword in a wide, horizontal arc, aiming for Mannimarco's ribs. The necromancer stepped back, allowing the blade to scrape against the polished femurs of the throne. He lunged forward, driving the obsidian dagger toward the operative's neck. The operative raised their iron shield, catching the jagged blade against the metal rim. The impact sent a sharp vibration up the operative's arm. They pushed the shield forward, knocking Mannimarco off balance, and followed with a quick, vertical strike from their longsword. The steel blade cut deeply across the necromancer's chest, tearing the grey robes and exposing the pale, tight skin underneath. Mannimarco stumbled backward, black blood dripping from the open wound. He dropped the obsidian dagger and raised both hands, attempting to channel a localized frost spell to freeze the operative's joints. The operative did not stop moving. They stepped inside the arch-necromancer's guard and drove the steel longsword directly through his stomach, pinning him against the bone throne. Mannimarco gasped, his pale eyes widening. The physical avatar of the King of Worms collapsed onto the ice, the purple magicka draining entirely from his skin. His body dissolved rapidly, leaving only a pile of white bone dust and torn grey fabric on the frozen river. The operative stood over the remains, breathing heavily, their sword dripping with dark fluid. They reached into their pack and retrieved the colossal black soul gem. The crystal was entirely dark, the massive soul energy of Hannibal Traven completely spent in defending against the extraction spell. The operative placed the empty gem back into their pack, turned away from the bone throne, and walked out of the freezing cavern, successfully eliminating the arch-necromancer's physical anchor to the mortal plane. The Order of the Black Worm fractured. Without the physical presence of Mannimarco or the central authority of the Skurg Barrow, the cultists scattered across Tamriel. They retreated deeper into the isolated swamps of Black Marsh and the dense forests of Valenwood. They operated in small, disorganized cells, entirely dependent on the pale purple light of the necromancer's moon to charge their black soul gems. The Mages Guild rebuilt the Bruma Guild Hall, replacing the burned timber with heavy stone blocks. The Imperial Legion maintained their patrols along the cobblestone roads, watching the tree lines for any sign of dark robes or reanimated corpses. The celestial body remained in the night sky. The necromancer's moon orbited Nirn on a fixed path, occasionally eclipsing the larger planet Arche. During these specific lunar alignments, the protective wards of the burial god failed entirely. The scattered cultists emerged from their hiding places during these eclipses, using the direct light of the moon to trap mortal souls and continue their dark practices. Mannimarco achieved his ascension, leaving his physical form behind to exist as a constant orbiting threat, his influence permanently written into the astronomical charts of the Empire. The study of magic continued within the stone walls of the Arcane University. The senior mages locked the records of the Soul Burst, the Plane Meld, and the creation of the colossal Black Soul Gem deep within the restricted archives. The common people of the provinces watched the night sky, noting the pale purple light that periodically washed over the graveyards. The name of the King of Worms shifted from immediate terror to historical legend, spoken quietly by apprentices and scholars who understood that while the physical avatar was destroyed, the arch-necromancer had successfully secured his place among the stars. The massive purple sphere of the necromancer's moon continued its trajectory across the night sky. It cast a trail of pale light over the cloud cover. During specific lunar cycles, the moon passed directly in front of the planet Arche, casting a deep purple shadow over the surface of Nirn. This physical alignment intercepted the light of the burial god, severing the divine wards covering the graveyards below. Following the physical destruction of Mannimarco's mortal avatar, the surviving acolytes of the worm cult scattered across the continent. They moved into the northern snowfields of Skyrim and the deep canyons of Hammerfell. They wore thick, grey wool cloaks over their black robes, matching the appearance of common travelers. They occupied ruined stone forts and collapsed Nordic barrows. When the purple light of the eclipse touched the dirt, the cultists emerged from their underground cellars. They carried empty grand soul gems carved from clear quartz. They placed the crystals on flat stone altars exposed to the open sky. The purple light struck the quartz. altering the mineral composition instantly. The clear glass turned to pitch-black obsidian, and a layer of white frost formed across the facets. The cultists gathered these newly forged black soul gems and placed them into heavy leather pouches. They used the gems to trap the souls of merchants, bandits, and traveling clerics. They drove iron daggers into the chests of their captives and channeled the white soul energy directly into the black crystals. They used the trapped energy to reanimate skeletal constructs, binding the bone joints with blue threads of magicka to guard the entrances of their hidden camps. In the decades following the Oblivion Crisis, new magical institutions replaced the fractured Mages Guild. The scholars of the Synod in Cyrodiil and the mages of the College of Winterhold in Skyrim dispatched heavily armored operatives to clear out these isolated cult cells. The operatives kicked the rotting wooden doors of the ruined forts off their iron hinges. They swung steel swords and cast blasts of concentrated fire magicka, burning the cultists and their undead guards. The operatives recovered the black crystals and the thick, leather-bound manuscripts containing the arch-necromancer's original incantations. The scholars placed the confiscated black soul gems on brass pedestals within their secure stone vaults. They handled the frost-covered crystals with long iron tongs. They examined the trapped purple energy vibrating inside the obsidian. They read the manuscripts, turning the heavy parchment pages filled with complex geometric diagrams drawn in dark red ink. Through the physical preservation of these texts and the continuous orbit of the dark moon, Mannimarco's methods spread directly into the hands of a new generation of curious mages. The scholars closed the heavy wooden doors of their vaults, studying the extraction rituals under the light of small wax candles, preparing to replicate the exact spells designed by the King of Worms. The thick oak logs in the stone hearth crack under the intense heat. Bright orange sparks float upward into the dark soot of the chimney. The heavy iron latch on the wooden door holds the thick timber shut against the freezing winds blowing across the tundra. You sit in a chair covered with thick bear fur, resting your leather boots on the stone hearth. The tale of Mannimarco concludes with his physical avatar reduced to white ash on a frozen underground river, while his massive soul orbits the planet as a sphere of purple rock. In the damp caves of Cyrodiil and the snow-covered barrows of Skyrim, individuals in heavy black cloaks continue to gather around altars of cracked stone. They place clear quartz crystals under the open sky, watching the pale purple light of the new moon strike the glass and turn it into freezing obsidian. In the large stone cities, armored guards wrap heavy iron chains around wooden vault doors. They secure the confiscated iron mortuary tools and the dark parchment scrolls deep underground. Mannimarco walked away from the sunlit gardens of the Isle of Artaeum, gathered the rotting remains of fallen empires, and forced his own essence into the celestial map. Outside this hall, the snow falls steadily, covering the dirt paths and the pine branches in a thick layer of white. The green lights of the aurora shift slowly across the dark sky above the mountain peaks. The heat of the fire radiates across the stone floor, warming the heavy wool of your cloak. You can close your eyes and listen to the steady crackle of the burning wood. Rest your head against the back of the chair and let your breathing slow down. We will find another path to walk and another history to uncover when the sun rises. May your road lead you to warm sands.